My metabolism is insane.
My metabolism barely exists, and I'm somehow thriving.
How?
It's called efficiency.
Here is to 8.2 energy flow through ecosystems. Note disclaimer.
When it comes to organism strategies, we now understand, after covering Units 1 through Unit 7, that energy plays a big impact on how organisms survive, grow, reproduce, and sustain homeostasis. When it comes to energy, remember that homeostasis is all about internal balance. The methods which are used to acquire or utilize energy are influenced by physiological characteristics. For example, if you are a human being, you will require a lot more energy than something like a tiny bug. Also, another method is the environment in which it inhabits. So energy is going to be a lot different for us human beings than that bug that lives in the soil. So energy flow and organism strategies is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. Let's talk about energy balance. We measure this through the net energy, which is all about the subtraction of energy consumed minus energy used. If the difference is positive, then we say that there's a net energy gained, where the energy consumed is greater than the energy used. In this case, energy is stored. For example, if you ate a lot of food and sat very still, you'd say that you have a lot of energy stored. This not might be a good thing for humans, but for other species it's beneficial because alongside with growth, which means you have increased body mass, you have increased reproduction, higher survival during food shortages, and better stress tolerance. In comparison, when you have a net energy loss, we have a higher rate of saying that the energy is used, which is greater than the energy consumed, which means say you're running around but you don't consume a lot, we'd say that energy is lost. The effects of this is weight loss, reduced or no reproduction, lower survival, and death if prolonged. And this is same thing with other species as well. So you can see the benefits for species outside of humans, how net energy gain would be more beneficial than net energy loss. Now let's take a look at this idea of energy availability. When we're talking about high energy versus low energy, we're talking about environmental conditions that are very different as well. For example, if we have high energy, that means that we're able to have stable conditions, so hurricanes and floods don't really exist. We have plenty of food and abundant sunlight. Oftentimes, this includes reproduction sexually, and the key benefits include genetic variation, improved long-term resilience, better adaptation to changes, and offspring diversity advantage. So basically, if you notice with high energy, the environment is perfect, so that way you can produce offspring often and have that genetic variability. So one leads to the other. Now, with low energy, you have limited food and unstable conditions. So this would be a great picture to demonstrate that. I want you to think about when we talked about the endosymbiotic theory, this idea that the environment once upon a time did not have oxygen, and those organisms participated in asexual reproduction. When that was the case, they had faster reproduction. There's no outside energy being spent. ATP was not a topic that we really talked about in that portion. We have rapid population growth and efficient use with limited resources. For example, a world without oxygen. So you could see how organisms might modify their reproductive strategies according to the energy resources that are readily available within their environment.
I'm already running around and exploring. I generate my own body heat from inside.
Let's compare endotherms, which are considered warm-blooded, versus ectotherms, which are considered cold-blooded. I want you to compare yourself, a human being, to a fish. So, for human beings, we have internal metabolism, such as this idea that we have cellular respiration. If you remember in previous units, we talked about ATP for humans. So, we generate heat source through cellular respiration. In comparison, if you take a look at a fish, they have to depend on external environments for their heat, sun, shade, water. So for a fish, they depend on the water and the sun. If you look at a body of water and if the water underneath freezes, you'll see that the fish also freezes as well. Now, oftentimes we do know that if you were to take a look at a glacier, the top freezes below the water is often moving, and that's because the temperature is different. But if you were to look at a body of water and the temperature of that water all freezes, then the fish in that environment would also freeze as well, which leads us to our second topic, which is body temperature. For humans, we're stable and constant. So, for example, in human beings, no matter if it's hot or cold, we can stay in those temperatures. We just work around it. Whereas, depending for that fish, which is an ectotherm, it varies with the environment. So, the fish takes on the temperature that's surrounded by them, aka their environment. In terms of energy use, we utilize a lot of energy as endotherms, whereas ectotherms, they don't utilize a lot of energy. We have a high food intake as endotherms. We're frequent, we require a lot of meals, and usually it's in large amounts. Now, if you compare that to a fish, which is an ectotherm, if you notice you only feed a fish very infrequently, and you can go long periods of time without food. Activity level with endotherms, they're consistent regardless of temperature. So we often maintain the same activity level day to day. There's not much in variation. Whereas for animals such as the fish, they're dependent on their environmental temperature as to how they go about their day. Now, this leads us to the typical behavior, which endotherms remain active in cold conditions. For example, if you walk in the warm temperature and you walk in the cold temperature, you'll notice if you continue to walk faster, you'll tend to warm up, and that's because your body is able to remain active in those cold temperatures. Where the typical behavior of an ectotherm is trying to bask to warm up, and they try to hide to cool down. So they'll go to environments that suit them. So if you see a flock of fish that needs to warm up, they'll go near the surface where the sun hits. If they need to cool down, they'll go away from that surface so they go to a cooler temperature area. So once again, they're dependent on their external environment. Examples of endotherms include ourselves, birds, mammals, whereas ectotherms are things like reptiles, amphibians, fish, and insects. The benefit of being an endotherm is that we can stay active in cold temperatures, but a disadvantage is that we have to eat frequently to maintain those temperatures. So we're constantly looking for food. However, with ectotherms, they can survive with little food. And the disadvantage is they're actively limited based on their environmental temperature. So for example, the amphibians or the fish are going to survive based on their outside environment. They can't independently decide to survive or not.
Come on, little friends. Come play with me.
No! Leave us alone!
You can't escape me.
Let's talk about energy flow direction. If you remember, in previous units, we talked about this term ATP, and we talked about the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration and another term known as thermodynamics. Well, energy flow is all about the direction and relationship of different organisms where perpetually we're taking the energy and harnessing it in a cycle. So, for example, the sun is being harnessed by plants which produce ATP, aka they're known as producers. And if you think about it, these plants are being eaten by other organisms, such as a bunny. This is known as a primary consumer. The bunny is going to be eaten by a fox, and that would be known as a secondary consumer. And that fox is eventually going to be eaten by a wolf, which would be considered a tertiary consumer. So the idea is that all of these different organisms are harnessing the sun's energy in a pattern known as energy
Watch
flow.
the energy flow.
Boing!
It's getting smaller.
Smaller still. Energy never disappears.
You might notice on this diagram on the left a triangle. Triangles are used to display how the bottom of the triangle feeds to the top of the triangle. You might have heard of food pyramids, or you might have heard of ecological pyramids, which is what this is. In this case, this is to display the trophic levels and the relationship of food eaten or consumed by the different organisms. Starting off with producers, which are considered to be autotrophs. Autotrophs is a term used to describe animals that are on autopilot when it comes to energy. So that's a way you can remember the fact that they have to capture energy directly from sun and chemicals. So things like plants are able to utilize photosynthesis, or in some cases, some other organisms are able to produce or capture energy through chemiosmosis. You might notice the root word chemio, which basically means chemicals. So chemiosmosis is the process of capturing energy through chemicals, and photosynthesis, as previously spoken about, is the process of synthesizing energy through photo or light, aka the sun. So the goal of autotrophs or producers is to convert the solar energy, the sun, to chemical energy via two processes, potentially photosynthesis or chemiosmosis. And the examples are plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. If we move up the ladder, you'll see that we have primary consumers. So what are primary consumers? Primary consumers are considered to be our vegetarians. So if you think about a bunny here, a bunny is not going to eat another organism. They're going to stick to a diet consumed of plants. And because of this, we say that primary consumers eat producers, i.e., plants, algae, or cyanobacteria. These include things like rabbits, deer, grasshoppers, and zooplankton. They obtain their energy directly from plants. They were the original vegetarians, essentially. Then we have secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are where we're starting to get into the process of consuming animal goods. So secondary consumers are things like your foxes, your small birds, and small fish. All of these organisms consume either other fish, or maybe birds consume worms, foxes consume the bunny, and because of this, they're considered primary consumer, or they consume primary consumers. Things like carnivores or omnivores is their role. And they obtain their energy not by sitting directly in the sun, but by consuming the primary consumers, which consume the producers. So secondary consumers consume primary consumers, which consume the producers. See how the triangle works all together? Then on the very top, we have tertiary consumers. They are considered to eat mainly secondary consumers, and they're considered to be predators, meaning that they are going to be the one that are going to eat secondary consumers and obtain their energy from various carnivores. These include things like hawks, wolves, lions, and large sharks. Now, if you notice here, we can talk about this ecological pyramid and note that the trophic levels can sometimes vary. So, for example, for us human beings, we consume both plants when we eat a very wholesome vegetarian-based diet, or we consume animal products. So just be aware of that when we're looking at the trophic levels. This is a very general rule to understand the different trophic levels. Now, the other one we didn't talk about is decomposers. You want to think about your fungi and bacteria. And as you notice, they're not in the triangle itself, and that's because they break down dead organic matter and recycle those nutrients, and often are consumed by various different groups. And because of this is why you see various triangle or various arrows drawn to the decomposers. They recycle the dead matter. And because of this, it doesn't really fall underneath that ecological pyramid. There is a 10% rule, which basically states that when we get to the very tippy top, only 10% of that energy is transferred from here to here to here to here. So that's why when you get all the way to the top, something like a tertiary consumer has to consume a large quantity of food to attain the proper energy that it needs. Versus a primary consumer is not going to do that because they're getting the energy required directly from the producer. Either which way, from each level, you want to remember that it's 10% of the energy from the previous level. And so that means that, for example, a producer has 100% energy, but they're only giving that 10% to that bunny that is consuming that plant because the 90% is basically lost in the transfer. Like it takes a lot of energy to go find the food and consume it. So 10% that's left over is what really is being transferred to that next trophic level. So that's where that 10% comes from. When we think about how energy is lost, you want to think about that 10% and understand that energy can be lost. Sometimes it's efficient and other times it's inefficient. So, for example, say, for example, an organism eats a food. They're going to constantly, for example, let's take a look at this fox. This fox is walking around looking for prey, also making sure that they're staying alive. So there's going to be a couple of basic processes that are going to consume the energy of that organism, which allows for that energy to be lost. For example, we have heat from cellular respiration. This fox has to breathe in and breathe out. And if you remember, an ATP was a big term, aka energy. And if you remember the different steps to produce energy or to produce that ATP, we have to consume some ATP to produce ATP. Remember, we talked about 34 or 36 net ATP when we talked about human beings and their ATP. Well, technically, we're producing more, but we're using more up in the process of cellular respiration. So the heat from cellular respiration is going to be some energy that's lost. There is basic energy used during life processes. For example, this fox might be running away from natural predators, or it could have to breathe because it's in an environment like a windy, wooded area, and it needs to have energy to basically process life processes. Because of this, the fox is going to use up that energy during that life process. Now, when energy is lost, it is also through heat surface. You have to think that a fox, or even us humans, if you take a look at yourself when you're sitting in a chair for a long period of time, if you leave that chair and you touch it, you could see that the heat is being placed on the chair, you'll see that the chair feels warm. And that's because the body of many organisms release heat during surface touch. So they release that heat to the surface. And so that's another way that energy is lost. Lastly, we have waste. What goes in must come out. And waste, such as urine, feces, or uneaten parts, takes time and energy to remove. And that is another way that energy is lost. So these are the four basic ways that organisms will lose energy, even though they consume energy as well. So why is energy transfer insufficient? Well, remember, energy is used for metabolism. And remember, we said that organisms can't absorb 100% of the energy. Remember that you have these other things that occur, for example, metabolism. ATP production means that we have heat release. The second law of thermodynamics basically states that energy transfers are inefficient. And that's why with each tropic level or each trophic level, you only attain 10% of that energy every time. So there's 10% here, 10% here, 10% here. And we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the energy transfer. It's not very efficient. Also, organisms don't absorb the 100% of consumed energy, and the trophic levels show that. We also know that there's other issues like the fact that we have growth or heat loss or waste. This is key factors that show that energy transfer is generally lost and sometimes insufficient overall and can be a problem. The consequences of that 10% rule, which is this idea that energy is being lost during each of the tropic levels, we know that energy flows. It's not a cycle. And so we have short food chains and small top predator populations, which is important to note because producers form the base of all ecosystems. Think about it. Food chains are short. And because they're short, there's only usually 4 to 5 trophic levels like we showed you as an example. And we know that the energy is lost during each transfer. The top predators will require a large amount of food to consume or make up for the 10%. We also know biomass decreases after every trophic level, so there's less biomass, which basically means there's limited energy and energy pyramids are upright. We also know producers support more biomass than they do herbivores. So total plant biomass is going to exceed herbivore biomass. So at the very bottom of that food pyramid, we're going to have the highest biomass. And we know that producers are continuously capturing that energy through the process of photosynthesis. When we're talking about biomass, by the way, we're talking about mass. Okay, we're talking about the actual mass of each level. So for example, when we're talking about the biomass is in a pyramid, we're basically saying that we're talking about the weight after water is removed from each organism, and it's constantly varied with each animal. So the top of the biomass or the top of that food triangle, the top of the ecological pyramid is going to be a less biomass. So that's what you want to get from the consequences of the 10% rule. That after it goes up that triangle, with each animal, the top predator is going to consume a lot more food to try to compensate for that loss versus a bird or a bunny has to consume less food and material to compensate as well.
Whoa! So green and wet. It's hot and dry. Brrr. So cold.
Now let's talk about ecological levels of organization. Starting off with an organism, You want to think of a single living creature. In this case, we talk about the fox. And basically, it's able to carry out its own life processes, including a focus on survival, behavior, and physiology. A group of foxes together are known as a population, basically the same species that's able to live in the same geographic area. The key features is so that foxes can interact with each other, and the focus is basically population size, growth, and density. So we're talking about the life of various foxes in this case within a given area due to that interbreeding. Once we get to community, we're talking about multiple species living together. So no longer are we talking about the fox itself, but we're talking about the birds in the sky or the fish in the sea. The goal is we have different species that are living and interacting with one another. Now, communities are only biological interactions only, so we're focusing in on living items. So these are species interactions with one another. So prey predator relationships between the fox, maybe a snake, and the hawk that wants to eat the fox. So that's what a community is all about. And then we talk about ecosystems, which now doesn't just focus on living things, but living and non-living things. So this includes all the energy flow that's involved in the ecosystem. So we're talking about the forest ecosystem or the lake ecosystem. It's all about energy flow and nutrient cycling, which leads us to our next category, which is the biome. This is a large region of climates similar to one another. So you want to think about a desert or a tropical rainforest or even a tundra. These are going to span multiple ecosystems. And we're going to talk about specifics in just a second, but you want to think of it as a biome being the climate-driven patterns of that specific area. With that being said, a bunch of biomes together formulates biospheres, which is all the life on Earth. It's considered the highest level of organization and includes all sorts of global interactions when it comes to life. Now, let's talk about the biomes more in detail. We could have a tropical rainforest. And if you remember, when we're talking about biomes, I want to preface this that biomes are all about the temperature driven within that area. So when we're talking about a tropical rainforest, we're talking about high rainfall, warm temperatures, and rich biodiversity. If you think about our rainforests today, they're few and far between because the thing is we consistently utilize them for human usage. We might cut down trees, but there's a lot of varied species that depend on tropical rainforests. They have high rainfall and rich biodiversity, warm temperatures throughout the year, which is really important for sustaining different species, which is why there has been a push in the last 2 decades or so to ensure the safety of those tropical rainforests. Then we have deserts, which are marked by low rainfall, extreme temperature variations, and limited vegetation. If you remember, we talked about CAM, C4, C3 plants in bio in the previous unit related to photosynthesis, and that's because we were focusing in on deserts, which have very low rainfall and extreme temperatures where the plants need to sustain themselves. So things like cactuses are very much prevalent in deserts because they don't need a lot of water. They are able to hold in their water because of the low rainfall. And so there's very sparse vegetation when it comes to these deserts. Let's talk about a temperate grassland. So temperate grasslands are basically moderate rainfall. They have seasonal changes and predominantly covered in grass. So if you see a forest with just grass, that's your key indicator where there's sort of like the seasonal changes, but a lot of grass, that's your temperate grassland. Now, temperate forests are included with changing seasons. So there's specifically four seasons: fall, winter, spring, and summer. The most popular images are often show the fall changing leaves because they have deciduous trees and evergreens where you have very distinct features in the fall. So that's a prominent key indicator. Then we have taigas or boreal forests. These are known for having very low rainfalls. Coniferous trees are very prominent there, and they have very cold winters. So you'll sometimes see sparse snow here. As compared to a tundra, which is actually very cold temperatures, permafrost is very prevalent there. There's minimal plant life, and oftentimes you don't see a lot of humans living in that area. It's not really prominent for that environment. Now, when we talk about those little tropic levels and the interactions with the different biomes, and now that we understand the relationship between the two, we need to talk about the energy flow. We have solar energy input, the idea that the sun will emit energy that reaches the earth is the primary focus of most ecosystems. We also know that plants or producers harness that sun's energy, and it is done through the process of photosynthesis. We also know that chemical energy is stored. This idea that plants or light energy can transform into chemical energy. And if you remember in our chapter related to photosynthesis, we talked about C6H12O6. And if you remember in Unit 1, that is a type of carbohydrate also known as glucose. And this is important as it's stored within organic molecules. And if you remember in carbohydrates, that means it has a high energy density. So that's why chemical energy is stored that way. We also know that energy flows up in tropic levels. We dictated a triangle, and we now know that we have to consume from the lower levels of the triangle to gain the highest energy to acquire up. And because each time it will get lower and lower. So something like a plant is going to provide energy to another species, which will provide energy to another species, and so on and so on. But each time there's a 10% loss of that energy each time it transfers over.
The abiotic world. The biotic world.
Let's talk about matter cycling versus energy flow. The idea is that energy must flow constantly from the sun, and matter must be efficiently recycled on Earth because different organisms need both energy and matter to build their bodies. For example, if you think about a hawk needs other animals to sustain itself, but it also needs the energy to flow through itself. This is an interesting example, but when we talk about energy flow, we're talking about one direction. It's going in versus coming out. So how much energy as we as human beings consuming versus what are we releasing? It enters as the sunlight when we talk about entry into the ecosystem. Now, for matter cycling, it's cyclical. So it means that it's dependent on different species and the presence of what is happening on Earth. So the entry into the ecosystem is always going to be present on Earth. I want you to think about that hawk. If the hawk is consuming another animal and then that animal is decaying, for example, it's going to be present on that Earth. And so that matter then becomes dust. So this leads us to our movement. For matter cycling, it's between biotic and abiotic components. Think about the fact that you have something living like a hawk, which then decomposes and breaks down into something like dirt or mud. It's consistently recycling when it comes to matter cycling. However, when we're talking about recycling for energy flow, it can't be recycled. Remember, energy can't be created nor destroyed, right? But energy is flowing through the different tropic levels. So, what happens with each tropic level? We know that as it goes up, we have a 90% loss with each tropic level. However, with matter cycling, there's no loss of atoms. Matter is just being rearranged. And you can think of, if you remember, solid, liquid, and gas from chemistry. If a water turns from ice to a liquid to a gas, it's still water, right? But if you remember, the particles inside are going to be bouncing around a lot more quicker if it's a gas. And so matter is just being rearranged from that original form of ice when it converts to gas. And that's matter cycling. It still has the same matter in it. It's just the matter is being rearranged. When it comes to the pathway of energy flow, it goes from sun to producers. Remember, primary and secondary producers, then consumers, then heat. Whereas for matter, it's just an organism into the environment and then back into an organism. Think about an organism decomposing. That's going to go back into the environment, and then the environment will help produce plants, which assist organisms, right? So that is matter cycling. Supply for energy and matter cycling are both limited, but with the supply, energy is consistently being replenished by the sun. And with matter cycling, it must be reused efficiently to continue forward. And the role of energy in organisms is to provide metabolism and make sure that we're able to sustain life processes. But with matter cycling, it's to build bodies and molecules with the atoms that are provided internally. So we could say matter cycling is more chemically based, where energy flow is more biologically based. I'm not saying they're both technically chemicals, but the thought process is a little bit different. And this just shows a picture of what we mean, that at each tropic level, 90% of that energy is lost, but 10% is passed on each time. And that's because we have these conditions of metabolism, movement, growth and repair, reproduction, and body temperature, especially with endotherms, that plays a key factor into this idea. When we talk about abiotic versus biotic, we often use the word reservoirs. So reservoirs are locations where these elements tend to live within a period of time. So abiotic means non-living, so they include things like gases, soil, oceans, bodies of water, rocks, minerals, dirt, groundwater. Now, when we're talking about biotic reservoir, biotic meaning biology, which means living, we're talking about plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, and decomposers. So when I say decomposers, like the fact that it's decomposing down into something is going to be considered biotic. So that's the difference between the two.
Where is Earth's water? Oceans, ice caps and glaciers, groundwater, surface water, atmosphere, living organisms.
We have been talking a lot about the sun. In juxtaposition, let's talk about the Earth's water. 90% of our water is found in oceans. 97% of the Earth's water is our largest reservoir. Our second largest reservoir of water is going to be frozen storage that is found in ice caps and glaciers. And then we have our third form of water found in groundwater, which is in soils and rocks. So if you're walking in a very moist area, you can sometimes feel the water in the soil as you're walking upon it. Then we have surface water. These are bodies of water that are a lot smaller, things like lakes, rivers, and streams. We have atmospheric water, which you can find in the clouds, and sometimes you can find water in living organisms such as plants and animals. Remember, plants consume water, and we as animals, we also consume water. So that's where some of the leftover water stays. Now, when we were talking in Unit 1, if you remember, we talked about H2O and how H2O is a very unique molecule as water because it has these unique processes. Water key processes in the environment include things like evaporation, which means that we're taking the liquid water and allowing for the sun to produce water vapors or gas from that surface. So sometimes if you see a large landmass of water, you'll find these fumes coming from the water, and that's because the sun is allowing for the creation of that water vapor or gas from the liquid water, especially in large bodies of water. Then we have condensation, which allows for the water vapor to then formulate these liquid droplets. This is really high in atmosphere as the air cools. It usually forms fogs or clouds sometimes, and this should not be confused with precipitation, which takes the form of droplets such as rain, snow, and hail that allow for water to fall to the ground or land surface when the water droplets become very heavy. Then we have transpiration. Transpiration is a process that plants allow for leaves. And if you remember in photosynthesis, we talked about the gas exchange opening known as the stomata. Well, transpiration is about allowing the water to remove itself from the plant through that stomata. And water will return to the atmosphere from those plants. Then we have infiltration, also known as percolation, which is when the water essentially soaks into the soil and rocks and it moves downward through the soil layers. So if you sometimes dig into the soil really, really hard, you'll find out that there's like bodies of water deep within. And this is important because it allows for replenishing groundwater and aquifers. Aquifers, if you look at that aqua root, that means water. Then we have runoffs, which is when the water flows over to the land surface. And this is when soil can't absorb water enough. This is usually when we have floods or things of that nature, and allows for water to return back to rivers, lakes, and oceans. So, in total, why does this matter? Because it allows water to move. If you notice in all these processes, clouds move from one location to the next, or the fact that the soil allows for water movement as well. And this allows us to deliver nutrients, regulate climate, shape the land, erosion in soil, support life. And because if we're moving that water, we're able to sustain multiple life forms. And it's often driven by solar energy. So this is where the sun and the water fall hand in hand with one another. Let's take it back to Unit 1, where we focused in on macromolecules. There are four major macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. The common theme about all of these is that they contain carbon. Carbon is pretty much a big deal as it's the backbone of life. Since all living things contain carbon, how carbon moves throughout the earth directly affects the ecosystems and climate. We do need carbon, and we're going to talk about in this video about carbon and its functionality. Please note carbon can be formulated in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide, which functions as a greenhouse gas. So while there are many positive qualities of carbon, this also means that CO2 contributes to what we now know as global warming. Let's talk about the main carbon reservoirs. Later on, we're going to focus on these reservoirs and how they interact with one another. Firstly, you have the atmosphere, where carbon exists mainly as CO2. In fact, it's about 0.04% of the air. Seems rather small, right? With the biosphere, which we talked about previously, carbon is stored within living organisms like you and I. We have fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas that are buried underground, and they too contain or emit carbon. Oceans do have carbon as well. Dissolved CO2 and carbonate compounds exist there. Soil, well, with soil, we have to think that organic matter decomposes in the soil. And when that happens, that organic matter, like you and I and living organisms, are going to break down our components, which include carbon. And this leads us to rocks. Soil formulates rocks over time, and it's locked into things like limestone and other carbonate rocks. Further in this video, we're going to talk more about the carbon cycle. So make sure you stick around as we go deep into understanding how carbon works and how the cycle works together in detail. The following image here basically integrates the key features that are important for the carbon cycle. Firstly, as you can see here, there is some CO2 which is consistently being released or being placed in, so meaning captured. So it can be placed in or released, and that's what makes it the carbon cycle. Let's start off with the process of photosynthesis here. And you'll notice that it's near some plants here. The process of photosynthesis is previously broken down in another unit. I would check out the playlist related to the whole AP biology curriculum, and you'll see there is a video link there that just talks about photosynthesis itself. But that video goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to provide here. The basic understanding here is that we have a little bit of CO2, and we're going to add that to our sunlight here. Plus, we have water that we give plants, so I'm going to say H2O. And that goes into the process of photosynthesis. And out what's produced is some glucose, C6, H12, O6. And you'll notice there that there is also going to be some O2 release as well, but that's not important for this video. What I want you to focus in is the C6H12O6. If you remember from Unit 1, we had a whole macromolecule breakdown, and there's a whole macromolecule video called carbohydrates, and this is a type of carbohydrate. If you want more details about that, once again, I would tell you to check out our AP biology course, and you can type in or search the carbohydrate related video. It's in Unit 1, and you'll see the more details about how we talk about the macromolecule of glucose, or specifically carbohydrates, and glucose is a type of macromolecule. What happens in plants is we have glucose that's being released, and that's alongside the water, but once again, I want to focus in on glucose because you have the C6 here. This is important to understand because CO2, while it's being removed from the atmosphere, it's being captured in plants in the form of glucose and other organic molecules. The carbon is stored in the plant biomass, and it's stored in the form of glucose, starch, cellulose, all different types of carbs, which contain the element C and the element O. So CO2 essentially, or carbon more specifically. So it's being stored here. And then this releases this product essentially. And I want you to remember that eventually this will decay and come back to CO2 release. But for now, we're just understanding that basic concept before we move on to the next one, which is cellular respiration. Now, animals like this one here respire, they breathe. And if you want more details about cellular respiration, there is a whole video on that as well. I would check out cellular respiration by, once again, going to our playlist related to AP Bio or courses, and you'll see the video listed there. Now, I'm going to add that also somewhere here, the whole playlist, so you can search that as well. But what I wanted to point out is that when you have animals, they respire, and that means that they're going to consume some products. Remember, they have different diets as well. So an animal like this, it looks like it's a deer here, might consume some forest, so some plants, which means that they're going to consume that glucose. So they have that coming in, and they're going to consume that glucose, and they're going to breathe in also some oxygen, which is also released by our plants. And then what ends up happening when they are consuming those items in the mitochondria, the goal is to take the C6H12O6 and go ahead and take the oxygen and then allow for respiration to occur where it goes and releases CO2 along with water and ATP. So I want you to keep that in mind that CO2 is being released in the form of animal respiration from photosynthesis. Then we have decomposition. So think about these animals and these plants that are eventually going to be passing away. These dead organisms are going to decay, and they also will produce waste products, which means in the soil you have decomposers and things like fungi and bacterial that will come from the soil. And these dead organisms and these waste products will eventually be stored, which means the CO2 that's being consumed is going into that soil. So carbon is released as CO2 during the decay process, and that is important to note. We call this root respiration when we consider that CO2 releases that gas. So it is stored in the soil, but it will return back to the atmosphere. And nutrients also in the decay process are going to return into the soil as well. Now, remember, all of these animals are releasing O2 as well, oxygen, not O2, I mean, they're releasing H2O. They're releasing some water. We urinate, we defecate, and that releases H2O, which also goes in the soil. Well, that's being uprooted in our bodies of water, whether it be oceans or streams of water. And so we call that ocean uptake, where the ocean is taking up that CO2 that might be found in the soil or from nearby reservoirs, and that also is going to be released into the atmosphere as well. And if you remember in the process of photosynthesis, plants also respire as well. So they also are breathing out CO2 as well. So that's another thing to note. Now, sometimes these decaying plants will come about and be deceased for a very long time and produce what are known as fossils. And sometimes they can be used as fossil fuels as well. The burning of these fossil fuels might occur in something like a factory, which can be emitted in the form of coal, oil, or natural gas. The burning of this wood or biomass will be alongside and also release CO2 back into the environment as well. So these are some key processes that are important to understand when it comes to the carbon cycle. And more specifically, it's important to understand these patterns. So this just shows a key diagram of what we talked about alongside with a brief debriefing of what we stated in a description. So you have photosynthesis, decomposition, fossil fuels, and plant respiration. And you'll notice here the colors are matching the description of each of the processes we talked about. Now, on top of that, in this second photo here, I wanted to create a photo where I could talk about the negativity associated with this process because we don't really talk about CO2 in a positive light, which we did, but the thing is, CO2 has very much negative connotations as well. Fossil fuels add the new carbon and this leads to fossil fuel combustion. We can have deforestation that is occurring as well. Remember, we said that we have forests like rainforests that are constantly being deforested, which means this reduces photosynthesis. And what ends up happening is there's no plants taking in the CO2. So that means in the atmosphere, there's going to be an excess of CO2, which leads to the greenhouse effect and issues related to the climate. So the solution essentially is one day reducing emissions and increasing photosynthesis through reforestation, creating new plants to replace those previous plants that were once taken down. All in all, we talked about the four different processes here in the carbon cycle and the key chemical reactions. I wanted to place them down here so you can see it in table format. So you could see what goes in and what comes out. But once again, I would check out the videos related to photosynthesis, cellular respiration, if you want more details about both of these processes as well.
Hey, did you hear? We're apparently crucial to the nitrogen cycle.
What are you talking about? I just eat grass and produce methane.
Let's talk about how nitrogen works when it comes to the nitrogen cycle. If you remember, we talked about nitrogen as an element, and it is actually a essential element. If you remember, we talked about cones, so C, O, H, and then P as the essential elements. And we just talked about carbon and how oxygen and hydrogen are important in water. And now we're going to talk about nitrogen. So we talked about the carbon cycle. So what's important about nitrogen? It's a non-negotiable when it comes to life. It's found in key macromolecules. We talked about proteins, how they're essential in creating amino acids. We talked about DNA and RNA. And when I say we talked about, I just want to preface this by saying Unit 1 talks more details about these macromolecules. And you can find more details about this in there, but this is just a brief overview. Make sure to check out the video related to Unit 1 in our courses related to AP Bio, and you can see all the different types of macromolecules separated by lesson in Unit 1. So that's just a tiny little disclaimer there because that's where you're going to find proteins, DNA, and RNA, specifically in the macromolecule related to nucleic acids. We consistently talked about ATP, especially when we were talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, basically the unit related to the cells. We talked about the fact that cell has a need for creating ATP. And ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and the molecule creates nitrogen. Now, all organisms need nitrogen to continue to sustain itself. And the problem is, in terms of where nitrogen is mostly located, it is usually in the form of gas. So when we have gas in the form of N2, it's not really usable. So the challenge is being able to take the net negative of that N2 and creating it into a usable form, hence the nitrogen cycle essentially. We have major nutrient-dense nitrogen reservoirs. We had previously stated that it's in the atmosphere, and the goal is to try to utilize that. But we also can find the major source of nitrogen in other forms as well. Yes, 78% is in the atmosphere, but we can find it in oceans where we can find nitrogen compounds readily available, specifically nitrates, which is NO3, and ammonium, NH4, and sometimes we could find it in the gas form when different animals are down there or different plants are releasing different gases. So but the main form is these nitrates and ammonium. We can also find it in the soil. There are oftentimes dissolved nitrogen compounds in there, and we can find it in proteins and nucleic acids. Remember, all animals have a sense of DNA, and so therefore it's going to have that nitrogen in there. Now, let's talk about the key processes in the nitrogen cycle. Just like in the carbon cycle, there's going to be two photos, the simple one that you see here and a more detailed one. And we're going to cover the simple one before showing the more detailed one. So let's start off with nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is where we have atmospheric N2 and it's converted into usable forms, aka ammonia. So ammonia is going to be NH3. And why this matters is taking the atmospheric nitrogen, so this N2 here, let me use a different color here, a N2 here, and converting it into that NH3 is really important because what happens in nitrogen is we have a triple bond. Please note there are other elements in here, but in N2 we have a triple bond between the two nitrogens. And what happens here is this nitrogen fixation is the only process that you can break those triple bonds. Now, if you've taken chemistry before, you know the more bonds that you have, the stronger the bond, and therefore this is an example of that strong bond. And so what it does is you have nitrogen fixing bacteria. So, for example, you have something, it's called RHIZOBIUM. And what this is a root nodule of legumes like beans, peas, and clovers. And we have nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is going to take the rainwater and convert into nitrogen fixing bacteria. So what happens is you have nitrogen fixation, you have rainwater or thunderstorms that occur, and that also takes the atmospheric nitrogen that is in the atmosphere and brings it down into our soil. So now you see us focusing on that process. That's why there's a sharp bend here. And so what's happening is we're taking that rainwater and we're utilizing the atmospheric nitrogen and converting it into nitrogen fixing bacteria. Essentially, the goal is to take things like that, or there's free living in soil as well. This is or cyanobacteria, which is in sometimes you can find that in aquatic environments. We are focusing on the soil, but remember, if we have a body of water, there's sometimes soil nearby. So you could have cyanobacteria or azobacter, which is free living soil, free living in soil. So it's going to rudimentary take whatever's in the ground and complete that nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so that's the image that you see here. Now, some bacteria uses sunlight and some bacteria uses chemical energy. The main goal is that nitrogen has entered the biosphere and is running off into the body of ground, which leads us to our next step. Now, what consumes that soil? Oftentimes you'll have animals and they'll leave a different debris. For example, you'll have a cow. You can see the background here, the cow, and they'll have fecal matter that is released from that animal. And what's important is that it can be found in the animal because the animal will consume plants or other animals. And the result is the nitrogen becomes a really important part of living organisms. And the plants convert nitrogen into amino acids, proteins, nucleic acids, and ATP. So the plant is being consumed by these animals and they're going to defecate and really utilize the process of the nitrogen there. That process of a consumption is completed, and then what ends up happening is you have a process where it's literally called assimilation or using the nitrogen, and that's just the process of taking the NH4 or the NH3 from the soil. The assimilation basically is integrated into there. So it's a process that occurs simultaneously. So you'll see it here, the organisms using the nitrogen, and that's because they're consuming it or they're breaking it down. And that leads to the third step, which is ammonification. Now you can see here there's assimilation and ammonification happening simultaneously. So don't think that assimilation is just out here in the yonder. It's all happening at the same time, right? It's a cycle. So while you see assimilation here where it says organisms using nitrogen, they're basically talking about these cows over here and the other animals in the water basically utilizing the nitrogen in its format to become a part of living organisms. Now, we have to go back to the cows over here hidden in the background where they defecate. And then what happens is we have either dead animals or we have the release of fecal matter, and that's going to lead into decomposition that returns the nitrogen back in a process called ammonification. And it is just the conversion of NH3 and NH4. So that's why you see it happening simultaneously. And it's decomposing the bacteria and fungi. And the decomposers are basically taking the waste and the dead organisms and returning that nitrogen back into our soil for reuse. So that's where that comes in, which leads us to our fourth step, which is technically a two-part step, which is called nitrification. Nitrification is the process of taking NH4 or ammonium, you can see that here, and converting it into NO3. So it's a two-part process. And then what ends up happening is you have the second step, which is to take that NO2 and convert it into NO3. So this is where it all comes back together. You can see it says nitrying bacteria, because what happens in this in-between step is you're taking the NO2 and you're converting it into NO3, and it's happening in the soil where the bacteria in the soil gains the energy by oxidizing the nitrogen compounds, and then the ammonia basically becomes plant ready to nitrate. So that's where this is all coming in, where you have nitrification. Now, once this is all completed, you have denitrification. Basically, it means that it's going to go back into the atmosphere. So the denitrification bacteria, this is basically closing the loop. It is when the nitrate is going to utilize bacteria and take the anaerobic oxygen-free environment, such as waterlogging soils and sediments. This is why denitrifying bacteria is far away from our animals over there, because we want to note that it's oxygen-free. And what it's going to do is take that denitrifying bacteria and process nitrate to converting it back to the nitrogen gas. So the goal is to retain nitrogen gas back into the air. The conditions include low O2, and the nitrogen is just returning back to the atmosphere as it is. Now you can see there are some disruptions here. For example, we have to worry about fertilizers. Fertilizers are taking the fecal matter and reintroducing the excess of nitrates into the soil. So that is a human impact. We have eutrophication, which is nitrogen runoff from algal blooms, often leading in oxygen depletion and creating these dead zones. In industry, we have what's called the Haber-Bosch process, which is artificially fixing the nitrogen, and you'll see this near farms or locations where there are a large need for agriculture. And then pollution, which is nitrogen oxides that are emitted from vehicle exhaust systems. So from our buses and our trains and our planes and our cars, this is where you're going to see a high level pollution. This gives it more in detail to give you the key processes that we just talked about. So make sure you take a screenshot of this, as it gives you the color-coded identification as well. So you could see here's the purple, and then it gives you the definition of what's going on, or here's the, bluish pinkish color here with denitrification. So all of these are color-coded with the key processes in place to help you follow the very complicated nitrogen cycle. And if we were to break this down into a table, you could see here that we have the different types of microorganisms, so the nitrogen fixing bacteria and how it's converting the N2 into usable forms of nitrogen, nitrifying bacteria, how it's converting the ammonium to nitrate, denitrifying bacteria, how it's converting the nitrate back to the atmosphere, and the decomposers, which is all about breaking down the organic matter and releasing that ammonia into the atmosphere. Now, more details. I wanted to create a linear graphic so you could see more about that here, and you could see how this leads from assimilation and how you have all those macromolecules and you have consumption and death happening simultaneously. That's why we have the box listed here. The processes are listed in more table format if you want to see it more in detail, and it provides you a key reaction detail so that way you can have that for easy use. Remember, nitrogen fixation is the process of the only way nitrogen enters that biosphere. And then we have assimilation. Assimilation is how you integrate it into animals itself, like in its DNA, or through soil consumption, or through which is the process listed here. And then we have death and waste that happens with these different organisms where it's going to integrate into the soil. Then we have ammonification, which is going to take that dead organism or waste and convert it into usable forms of NH3 or NH4. Then we have nitrification, which is the ammonium is converted into nitrate in the two steps. And then what ends up happening is you release NO3. Once NO3 is then released, we have denitrification, which is the nitrate converting back into the gas. Now, because I wanted to make it linear, I put this sky in the ground, but you could see how it's not a linear process, it's a circular process, but hence it's called the nitrogen cycle. But this is just a easier way to see, and is a great summary table if you want to pause and take a screenshot of this. This will help you simplify the process for more details for your lesson.
Girl, did you hear? We're literally essential to the whole phosphorus cycle.
We're basically superheroes.
Now that's something to rock about!
Let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is very unique because, unlike carbon and nitrogen, it's not going to exist in gas form, which basically means that it can't enter or leave the atmosphere through volatilization. Because it's tied to rocks and sediments, its cycle is much slower. It prominently stays in those rocks and sediments, and that's why it's unique or different compared to the other two cycles. Now, with the phosphorus cycle, it's important because it is in our DNA and RNA. It helps make ATP. Remember, adenosine triphosphate, which is part of our energy currency, has three phosphates that are attached. And because of this, we notice that they do need phosphorus, essentially. Remember the phospholipid bilayer? Well, the phospholipid bilayer has phosphorus in it, so that's important to note. Now, with bones and teeth, they form calcium phosphate, which is very important when it comes to different vertebrates. And in terms of in the soil, they're a limiting nutrient, which basically means that they control the plant growth in our ecosystem. Now, where is phosphorus mainly located? Rocks and sediments, soil, living organisms, oceans, and sedimentary layers. Because of this, you're not going to find it oftentimes listed as somewhere in the air. Now, let's talk about the key processes that partake in the phosphorus cycle. Just like before, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the basics, and we're going to then show a more detailed photo. Now, let's start off with the first step. The first step we're going to start off with is the weathering of rocks. Now you can see that I have a cloud here with rain. And remember, phosphorus cycle is not atmospheric. However, it is highly dependent on rain, because what this does is the rain helps physically and chemically break down the rocks that are in the soil or near bodies of water or underneath bodies of water. This process is very slow and it might take thousands to millions of years. But the benefit is that the phosphate or PO43 minus is basically released into the soil and water in these ways. So it releases into the soil, and would be water. And this is helpful with different elements such as water, temperature changes, and organisms. So this leads to our next step, which is if you remember what producers are plants. So if we have soil, right, we eventually will have a plant like this, which will take up the phosphate that has been weathered in the soil. So that process is called assimilation. Assimilation in terms of biology is the process of plants absorbing this phosphate through the roots from the soil itself. And it's incorporated in nucleic acids such as DNA and RNA. We know this now, ATP, phospholipids, and bones, because it can be consumed by the plants. But remember, what consumes plants? That's going to be something like a consumer, which is basically letting us know that phosphorus is going to be transferred through various parts of the food chain, such as this cow here. And what ends up happening is herbivores, for example, will eat the plants which contain phosphorus. We have carnivores, which would then eat something like the cow and then obtain phosphorus that way. So, for example, if you are a meat eater and you eat the cow itself, you are considered a carnivore, and then you eat herbivores, such as this cow, which then ate different grass, which would have obtained the phosphorus from the soil and the ground. Then we have omnivores that eat both animals and plants. So that also means that it's going to be transferred in both ways. So the result in all this is phosphorus is going to flow throughout the different trophic levels. And remember, with each animal or plant, they're incorporated, by they I mean phosphorus is incorporated into DNA, RNA, ATP, phospholipids, and bones. So the result is that even though they are there innately, what happens is going to allow for the next step, which is decomposition. these animals or plants will eventually die and they will be in the soil. Animals will excrete also phosphorus through urine and feces, so that's another way of decomposition as well, through excretion. So we have death, excretion, and then what happens with all of this through decomposition is that they'll produce what are known as decomposers, which are basically like bacteria and fungi that will break it down in through organic material. So basically in this process, without using any sort of atmospheric influence, we really are breaking down phosphorus to return back to where we started, which is the soil, which leads us to the last step, which is sedimentation, which is technically long-term storage, which allows phosphate to basically accumulate into sedimentary rocks. There are different supplementary processes that also allow the rocks to go into the ocean as well and become part of the aquatic system. And so that is another way that it can enter into the ground through water. Sometimes this takes millions of years. So think about how slow this process is well. And the thing is, you have to think of tectonic plates. So in the ground itself, underneath the water, there are these movements that occur with the soil. And you want to think of earthquakes. So if we have two uplifting plates, then they'll produce a bend. Well, that bend itself will raise rocks back to the surface as well. So the ground is constantly moving. The other thing is we have weathering. So the weathering of rocks we have back again, which also supplements sedimentation because it exposes that phosphate again. So we have also other ways to think about this as well. We have leaching. So leaching is the process where the phosphate ions transfers from that soil into the groundwater or adjacent bodies of water. So that's what the other term of this is. And this releases into the soil and leads to things like eutrophication. So leaching is one of these ways that it can assist in sedimentation. The other thing to note is you could have, like we said, geological uplift of the formation of new rock that occurs and assists in that sedimentation. Because if you have those tectonic plates and they're moving around, that's going to uplift that phosphate as well when the bodies of water move around. Now, also we have phosphate fertilizer that comes from farming that's going to run off into bodies of water and ecosystems that are aquatic, leading to the formation of also phosphate sediments. So this is important as well. So you can see here the process of phosphorus cycle is pretty conducive to the soil and the ground and farmland. And with this, there are some disruptions and human impact. One of them is that it can become a limiting nutrient because weathering can't keep process with the biological uptakes. It's a very slow process. Now, long-term agricultural use, such as farming, can deplete the soil phosphorus as well. You have to think when there are farmers, they have land, they're using the same location over and over and over again. And what that means is those plants are going to participate in assimilation of the same soil area over and over and again. So that's going to limit the type of phosphorus uptake. Also, we as humans, we have mining extracts for different rocks, and the excess fertilizer runoff also adds to water bodies. Adding this causes that eutrophication, which is a little bit of a problem because it'll lead to algae bloom, which also means that if we have algae bloom, they're going to take up that oxygen that we need as human beings. So that's a disruption that we have with the phosphorus cycle. We have dead zones in rivers, lakes, and waters where phosphorus and nitrogen tend to accumulate as well. So there'll be areas where both of those elements will be heavy in. Now, if you need a more detailed photo of this, it's shown here where you could see the key reactions of what we talked about, the processes, what happens, and the results. So make sure to check that out if you want more details. And this is just a linear photo of what we talked about just to provide another perspective on the phosphorus cycle in case you need that too. Let's talk about what happens when we're comparing different ways that energy can play an effect on the system around us, especially our ecosystem. So, when it comes to our ecosystem, when energy increases, that also means that we have an increase in sunlight, increase in food, and increase in climate. What is the outcome of this? When energy increases, it has effect on organizations and population growth or population response. So what that means, when the energy increases, we have faster growth, higher reproductive rates, longer survival, more energy that's invested in offspring, including the quality and quantity combined, and increased ability to compete for resources. This basically means that we're looking at a J-shaped curve. A J-shaped curve is going to radically increase with exponential growth population size. And what that also means is that it starts off very low and then it reaches what's called the carrying capacity, the max potential. This is called a J-shaped curve. So if you're given a free response question or a multiple choice question and there's a J-shaped curve, your immediate thought process should be we're talking about ecology and we're specifically talking about energy increases. This is important to note. Now, in comparison, what happens when energy decreases? That means we have a decrease in sunlight, decrease in food, and decrease in climate. Everything happens in reverse. But what does that mean about the effect of organisms and population response? We have slower or stunted growth, reduced or halted reproduction, increased mortality rates, which means that we have increased death rates. We also have less energy that's invested in reproduction and offspring, which means that we also have increased competition for limited resources that surround in the environment itself, because the energy is not being able to produce enough resources for the population that's there. So what this means is, in terms of a population, it leads to a decline. And what happens is there's a curve called an S-shaped curve or a logistic growth curve. And basically what that means is you have a lag and then basically you have a decrease towards what it leads towards. So this is called an S-shaped curve. There's a lower carrying capacity. So unlike a J-shaped curve where it's growing up and that's what you want, what happens is there's an offset and then you have this eventual S-shaped curve that exists. The point of the S-shaped curve as compared to the other curves is you have a leveling off that exists that you don't see with the other curve that we spoke about. Now, with the other curve, when energy increases, it's just constantly going up. There is no potential for loss because you have invincible supplies because you have more energy. So if you have more energy, that means you can create more food, more resources, more sustainability. However, with energy decreasing, you have this point of rapid growth until there is a leveling off. And then what eventually will happen is possible local extinction due to that loss. So energy flow basically has different dynamics, and you could see that here, what we just showed or reviewed. So the less energy entering the ecosystem basically means that you have less food, less consumer population, less secondary consumer population will decrease more rapidly, and then there is a food web destabilizing. So essentially, you have a decline or collapse in that area. As compared to a producer increase, what happens is if you have more energy, that means that there's more sunlight, which also means that there's more producers or food, which means that all the herbivores and prey and carnivores can also grow as well because there is more food for consumers, more population increase, secondary consumers have more prey, and consumers' population will now increase. So this is a thriving ecosystem. So ideally, you want the J-shaped curve as compared to the sigmoidal curve, where you're just leveling off, destabilizing, or collapsing. So that's the way you can think about it overall. Now, these are just broken down into factors that affect that energy availability more in detail, such as seasonal changes, weather events, latitude, altitude. We could have resource availability issues such as water or nutrient availability and human impact. Right now, there's a lot of pollution that reduces what kind of nutrients are available due to the reduction of photosynthesis and energy overall. Now, let's take a look at the ecosystem disruptions in terms of the bottom up, beginning with the producers and ascending through the food chain, which basically means we're starting at the bottom of that triangle. The producer population changes significantly, meaning all the plants that you see are going to decrease, which means all the consumers are also going to decrease as well. So what this means is you have less energy, less biomass for the consumers. Herbivores will lack food. The food chain becomes unstable, and then the ecosystem once again will collapse. As compared to if we have growth, we have excess nutrients, and this can lead to eutrophication. And then what ends up happening is you eventually lead to oxygen depletion due to decomposers using up dissolved oxygen, and fishes kill and formation of dead zones. So basically, the increase or too much increase or decrease of producers have their own side effects when it comes to disruptions in the environment. So if you have producer growth, you want it at the right time with the right availability with the right resources. This leads to trophic cascades, which basically means that top predators with top predators, they move downward through the food chain. So you want to think about the the ecological pyramid and starting at the top here and then moving down. Say, for example, there's a decrease in the predator. What happens then is there's predation pressure decrease. So that means that the populations in the center of those trophic levels will start to rapidly increase, which means that the producers at the bottom portion will begin to decline because they're consuming a lot of their product or a lot of the food product. And then the habitat structure begins to change, and this also leads to destabilization. The key takeaway here is that top predators regulate ecosystems by controlling the prey population, and removing the top predators at the top of the food chain basically leads to top-down effects, population control, and no energy output. So overall, there are different ways that you can have issues, either with predators, preys, or with producers as well. Now that we have taken a look at all the cycles and all the different effects, here is an overall table in case you want to compare and contrast the different types of cycles. Now let's try a quiz question. Now take a moment, pause this video, and see what you can come up as the best answer. All right, so now let's take a look at this together. It says, which human activity directly alters all three cycles? Is it volcanic eruption, cellular respiration, industrial, agricultural, or weathering? And the best answer in this case is industrial agriculture, or anything that's agriculture related, because that affects the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus in different ways. So carbon basically through land use, nitrogen through fertilizer, and phosphorus through runoff. All three other ones vary for the three cycles. So this is a comparison of what they have in common.
Appreciate you riding along for our cosmic journey. If today's mission brought you the knowledge that slaps, make sure to hit that like button to boost that signal. Subscribe if you're locked in for our next watch. And don't miss the link tree. It's got all the goods for AP Bio, PSAT Math, and SAT Math. Before I sign out, make sure you're all in one orbit and diving in. Killing out. Till next time.